Laramie Sandquist, Senior Associate Vice President of Risk Management at Nationwide Agribusiness, based out of Des Moines, Iowa. I'll start with the statistics. We did a perception survey earlier this year and just asked folks, just in general, Nationwide Agribusiness obviously has a lot of farm customers out there. Just in general, how do they feel about the rural roads compared to some of the urban roads or the more city congested roads? And less than 1 in 10 people actually thought that the rural roads were considered dangerous. But if we look at the data from the National Highway Transportation Safety Administration, year over year, the rural roads continue to have about 40% of all the deaths that are happening across the country. And so, and the rural roads are also about 30% of the travel across the country. And so the numbers are not showing up as people perceive them. We actually are a little bit more dangerous than people perceive them. So we're just trying to get that awareness effort out there. And when you think about what are the challenges with rural roads, of course, we all know rural roads are a lot narrower. You usually have winding roads, you usually have less of a shoulder, you usually have things like that from an engineering standpoint. But you also think about just some of the distractions that are out there. You think about the slow-moving vehicles that are generally on our rural roads. You think about any other type of equipment that may be out there, but then you start thinking about the wildlife. And of course, this time of year here in Iowa, of course, we've got crops that are growing, so people are really in tune to, what do those look like? But then you also see, here in Iowa, we have a rag bri, they call it, a bike across Iowa next week, where we have bikers all over the country coming in to bike. But people are training for that coming up into that time of frame. So you have a lot of folks using these roadways for recreational purposes as well, health purposes, walking and running and biking and things like that. So just a lot of different things out there on the rural roads that we just have to be aware of and make sure that we're paying attention as we're out there. Yeah, so when they're out there with their farm equipment, first and foremost, if you are a slow-moving vehicle, let's make sure that we've got our hazards on, make sure that we've got our slow-moving vehicle triangles and things like that in place, and make sure that everything works. Some of these vehicles and even trailers we're not using on a regular basis, and making sure that they're maintained and in proper use while we're using them is important. Obviously, getting as direct or indirect to a place as possible. So if we can stay off the major highways and use more of a potentially indirect route on some of the gravel highways or less traveled highways, obviously that's going to be a little bit better for us. And then just being aware that 70% of these crashes are happening at speeds over 55 miles an hour. So, if you're towing something and you're going 25 miles an hour, being aware that this traffic coming up on you, unfortunately, is traveling a lot faster today than maybe it has been in the past, and making sure that we're just aware of what the true realities are out there on the roadways. So, and then of course, as a driver themselves, first and foremost, slow down, right? Let's be aware of what's out there. Let's know that, we are more susceptible to having slow moving vehicles out there. You're more susceptible to having ATVs and UTVs and maybe even some youthful folks out there driving on those. And so just being aware that, hey, there are these hazards out there and we want to slow down. And number two, avoid those distractions. As we all know on these rural roads, it doesn't take much to get off to the side of the road and lose control. And so we don't have that margin for error like you might have on a state highway or even an interstate highway. If you put your head, if you take your eyes off the road for 5 seconds at 55 miles an hour, you're traveling almost the length of a football field. And you put that into perspective, just to look down at your cell phone, for example, it's going to take you a good 5 to 7 seconds just to see like a text message coming through. And so trying to put that into true terms of how you could lose control and how you could get, into a tough situation pretty quickly is pretty easy to see. So just making sure that we're controlling those distractions and being aware of how distracted sometimes we are behind. There's no doubt. I think it depends on where you look, right? But we know that anytime you're looking at fatigue type situations, where I like to call it, it's middle of the afternoon is generally your toughest time. specifically as the summer months go on. People get done eating something, and generally that's getting towards the end of the workday for a lot of folks. And obviously, that's a lot when a lot more traffic is out there as well. So that tends to be a more more susceptible time of day. And of course, earlier in the morning. Depending on the shift work, if someone has been working the overnight shift or they're starting off the day, sometimes some of that fatigue steps in, but also there is more traffic during those times of day as well. So yeah, generally your early morning and your later in the afternoon drive times. Yeah, I think it really depends on what the farmer's doing out there. Obviously, if they're only taking up their lane of traffic, making sure that they're, well lit with the hazards on and things like that. If they would be having to, go over the center line just based off of the width of what they're towing or what they have, they're working with out there. Obviously, if they can get off further into the shoulder, depending on the situation, right, the better. If they do have that ability to make those slight adjustments, that will definitely help out. And there are times too where they can just slow down or turn off, whether it's a field approach or something like that, just to let some of that traffic go by. I know sometimes it gets bogged down at bridges and overpasses and things like that, that sometimes if they just wait a little bit, that can be helpful as well. So, and then of course, as we just talked about, try to avoid those times of day where there's going to be a lot more traffic on the roadways. I know sometimes that's not ideal and, it's not perfect from that perspective, but if you can plan your trips around, when they're going to have less traffic on the roadways, of course, that's going to be much better for everyone. Yeah, I would just say in general, right? Rural roads tend to be pretty safe. I don't want this to be more, I don't want people to take this as, we have bad statistics on the rural roads. It's just more of a wake up call and more of an awareness thing that, hey, we know distractions are out there. We actually did, as part of that study, we also found that 92% of people said that the use of mobile devices has increased year over year. Their perception of people being distracted behind the wheel. And I think we see that while we're out there. We see kind of the weaving that happens on the road. And, that might be okay on like an interstate highway because you got a little bit more margin for error. But when you start getting into some of our rural roads that don't have that margin for error, sometimes that can be a lot more dangerous. And sometimes, unfortunately, that can be deadly for us. So just being aware of what's out there, making sure that you're planning your trip in advance and making sure that you're driving as safely as possible to control what you can control out there on the highways.